I am happy to yield the floor to Brooke Norton, who will be reading our Bade Museum land acknowledgement and talking about the theme of today's lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you. So hello and welcome to today's lecture in the Migration, Borderlands, and Social Boundaries in Antiquity series, which is co-sponsored by the Bade Museum and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. My name is Brooke Norton. I'm the curator of the Bade Museum. And before we get started today, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Melissa Craddock, to read a brief statement on behalf of the Bade Museum.
Thanks, Brooke. We'd like to begin this talk today by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who've stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and ancestors. We're living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, gender, and other aspects of identity. We particularly welcome scholars who are engaging in risky topics in today's fraught political landscape, whose scholarship bridges past and present through the study of issues like migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Craddock. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Reverend Dr. Marvin Lance Weiser recently defended his dissertation, Belonging to Work and Working to Belong, Dissimilation and Differentiation Among Deportables Beyond the River. Marvin's academic interests gather at the intersections of migration, ethnicity, and labor. He has had the honor of being the archivist for the Sanctuary Movement Oral Histories and has worked at migrant labor justice centers. Marvin is currently a minister and director of community resilience and empowerment programs at Eden United Church of Christ, where he is active in coalition building and the beginnings of Poder, the Eden Power Collective. He is married to the love of his life, Juliana, a native of Mexico City and a marriage and family and narrative therapist, who is also the director of a Newcomer Navigation Center in Alameda County, serving primarily asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors. They have two wonderful daughters and a cute pup named Poncho. Most recently, thanks to a generous Lilly Endowment grant, they were able to reconnect with family and travel throughout Mexico, where Marvin learned more about the specialty coffee industry and its impact on labor and migration. Thank you, and the floor is now yours, Dr. Weiser.
Thank you very much. First of all, a very good morning to all. And before I get started with my talk, I'd like to thank Professor Brody and the Bade Museum, Pacific School of Religion, as well as the Archaeological Research Facility of UC Berkeley. Go Bears! As a member of a transnational family and a former migrant labor justice center organizer, I find the lecture series topic, migration, borderlands, and social boundaries in antiquity, truly fascinating and immensely consequential for a time such as this. And so I should also disclose that Professor Brody was my advisor and chair during my PhD program. And I recall shortly after President David Vasquez Levy came to PSR, the had a very moving art exhibition inside the museum pertaining to migration. Now, as my own interest was migration, during my residency, I would go on to go down that path more and learn more and walk with migrants during my residency at the GTU, Graduate Theological Union. And I would go on to be the archiver of the Oral Sanctuary Movement archives at the Flora Lamson Hewlett Library of the GTU, which led me to connect with other organizations like East Bay Sanctuary Covenant and Berkeley, and a host of others of whom I'm still in contact with. So that's a little bit about me, and thank you for that introduction, Brooke. Thank you for the land acknowledgement, Melissa. I'll go ahead and share I believe my slides here, and just make sure you can see them. Can you see those, Professor Brody?
Yeah, looks great. I'm going to tune out.
Okay. As was stated, the topic is more timely than ever, and there is much to be gleaned from migration studies, as well as approaching ethnicity, social boundaries, their formation and maintenance. And while I enjoy the materiality of archaeology, I myself spend more time excavating the strata of text and society. And today I find myself spending more time in movements with migrants than actually in the classroom. And so today's talk will be an exercise in interpretation, which is based on a section of my dissertation entitled Belonging to Work and Working to Belong, Dissimilation and Differentiation Among Deportables Beyond the River. It is a comparative study that utilizes Latinx studies framed by postcolonial anthropological and sociological understandings of theories of labor, migration, and ethnicity to derive a nuanced understanding of representations of Judean ethnicity during the Persian period, as found in the biblical books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ruth. In comparing Latinx migrant experiences within the U.S. context and its immigration policy to that found in Ezra and the Cyrus Cylinder, this lecture seeks to offer a nuanced interpretive perspective on the significance of Judean repatriation or remigration for the Persian Empire and the impact that that remigration had on the emergence of representations of Judean ethnicity. The Persian Empire often enjoys favorable reception in biblical studies, in contrast to its Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian predecessors, due in great part to Ezra and the Cyrus Cylinder, which chronicle emancipation and repatriation. However, I ask the question, what if repatriation had not been a benevolent gesture, but a change in administrative policy that served imperial ends? And how might this process have impacted representations of emerging Judean ethnicity? It is probably no surprise to us here in this session that migration is one of the central motifs of the Hebrew Bible, as it is with the human experience writ large. And it goes without saying that migration is one of the greatest informers of identity, individual, social, and ethnic. However, for many, it is still puzzling as to why there have been thousands of unauthorized daily crossings of migrants into the U.S. via the border it shares with Mexico. While it is beyond the scope of this talk, or any really to examine all root causes of migration, I will, however, briefly touch on one cause that in part contributes to this phenomenon: state labor and immigration policies. The two should be conceived as one and the same. As in the 1930s, the Bureau of Immigration was merged with the Bureau of Naturalization and housed within the Department of Labor. It was also around this time that the southern border, which had been semi-permeable, began to be federally policed, and Mexican nationals were required to start entering the U.S. via inspection at official ports of entry. Up until 1930, between 1850 and 1920, Mexicans were not a separate group for the nation's census. They were counted as white. They were expelled from this category in 1930, which underscored their deportability in an era of increased economic scarcity and competition. This new deportable class became a scapegoat. And as a result of administrative policy changes during the Great Depression, the Bureau of Immigration under the Department of Labor deported as many as 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Later, in 1942, during the U.S.'s labor shortage due to World War II, the U.S., however, signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement with Mexico, which initiated the Bracero program in Stockton, California. Ultimately, more than 4.6 million Mexican migrant workers would work in U.S. agricultural fields throughout the duration of the program, of what some term imported colonialism, which would span some 22 years. Unfortunately, braceros went without labor protections afforded to citizens, and dissenting Department of Labor officials described the program as legalized slavery. Some farmers conceded the fact we used to own our slaves. Now we just rent them. Mexican labor came to be seen as naturally fitting the requirements for U.S. agribusiness, as Mexican labor was seasonal and return migration occurred after the harvest season. At times, mass deportations would occur to hasten this process. As the Bracero program ended in 1964, a provision was made as part of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act amendments that widened the scope of Mexican labor from the fields to the factories. The Border Industrialization Program, also known as BIP. With this agreement, the locale of labor would be positioned beyond the river, on the Mexican side of the border within maquiladoras, allowing the U.S. to externalize the cost of this extraction of labor. For example, requiring Mexico to pay for the laborers' health care, education, etc. Now, for those who may be unfamiliar, a maquiladora is a factory in Mexico located within the Mexico-U.S. export processing zone. It is usually owned and managed by a U.S. corporation and uses Mexican labor. It receives imported raw material from the U.S. and then exports the completed products back across the border. It does so duty-free with no or greatly reduced taxes and tariffs. That may be changing. BIP increased Mexican dependence upon the U.S., as half of Mexico's exports eventually came from this export processing zone within years of NAFTA going into effect. And by the turn of the century, almost 1 million workers were employed in the plants, a burgeoning multi-billion-dollar industry. Without adequate worker protections, the maquiladoras, as we know, became a bastion for bad actors, obfuscating labor law. Workers decried the conditions, lamenting, "Here on the border, we are just slaves." After BIP replaced the Bracero program, foreign-born labor grew outside of the agricultural sector, and a dual market and wage system arose by ascribing certain immigrants statuses of legal or illegal. For the segment of this foreign-born labor that is subject to deportation, mechanisms of the state were developed to create and keep control of this emerging group. It is their ascribed deportability that both prevents upward social and economic mobility, and so prolongs their servitude in underpaid positions. For example, local authorities are often found to be in cahoots with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, serving employers and consumers' interests by carrying out raids just before labor organizing actions or strikes. This illegality is utilized to enforce a segmented labor market in order to keep some labor, and by extension, some commodities, services, and products artificially cheap. The U.S. immigration system then actually incentivizes so-called illegal migration to sustain this segmented market. This can be seen in current immigration law, as in many circumstances, an immigrant from Mexico, for example, can enter the U.S. without inspection and eventually adjust their status more than a decade before they would even be considered for legal immigration via consular services. Anthropologist Seth Holmes explores contradictory economic and political forces within the U.S. system of migrant labor. Economic forces invite undocumented migrant labor, while political forces ban undocumented labor. For example, it was not long after signing NAFTA into law, President Clinton signed legislation revoking social benefits from migrants, further exacerbating and externalizing the real cost of free trade. This legislated segmented ethnicity citizenship labor system has been overall less expensive than slavery, and even helped sustain citizen class benefits like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The Southern Poverty Law Center examined this liminal space that migrants often occupy between slavery and free labor in a report entitled Close to Slavery. It is this not enslaved nor entirely free condition that is well attested in the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods. Tero Alstola, in his study Judeans in Babylonia, a study of deportees in the 6th and 5th century BCE, covers the period from 591 to 413 BCE, the first to the last recorded cuneiform attestations of Judeans in Babylonia. He reveals that the majority of cuneiform sources mentioning Judeans pertain to a land for service tax sector of Babylonian agriculture. Alstola explains that the Akkadian term Shusheno is often used in the text from Al-Yahudo when referring to Judeans, which denotes a status different from that of a slave or a fully free person. The Shusheno held an in-between status, akin to an undocumented person of today, a semi-free class that could hold and work land, but the state and or its representatives could exploit their labor and movement. Babylon kept deportees under its control, with their main destination being this land for service sector in the countryside. The ancient deportation regime met imperial needs through deportable labor power by both increasing agricultural output and providing the state with taxes, soldiers, and labor through this system. As I stated earlier, the Persian Empire, unlike its predecessors, the Neo-Babylonian and Assyrian empires, enjoys a more favorable reception in modern perception. Upon conquering Babylon, Cyrus the Great allowed for repatriation back across the Euphrates for many people groups and permitted the reconstruction of temples and their functions, as they were the primary mechanisms for the collection of tributes and taxes. Consequently, the Persian Empire gained a reputation for being religiously tolerant. The Cyrus cylinder records, I, Cyrus, king of the universe, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters, the city of Babylon and all its cultic centers I maintained in well-being. The inhabitants of Babylon, who against the will of the gods, a yoke unsuitable for them, I allowed them to find rest from their exhaustion. Their servitude I loosened. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced at my deeds. And Fitzpatrick McKinley, though, argues that the so-called Edict of Cyrus, as found in Ezra chapter 1 and 2 Chronicles 36, Persian religious tolerance, and a broad program of repatriation is not to be generalized. Rather, she interprets the Cyrus cylinder within the more narrow context of Assyrian-Babylonian relations. While Fitzpatrick McKinley concedes that there is a marked distinction between Persian and Babylonian, and especially Assyrian royal iconography, she asserts that the general absence of violent militaristic royal representation should not indicate that the Persians too did not rule harshly when it served imperial ends. On the contrary, where the Assyrians and Babylonians did allow indigenous autonomy within cultic centers, the Persians installed Persian officials to oversee operations, including financial matters. Temple administration under Persian rule was brought under imperial administration, as we see in Ezra and Nehemiah. Persians, as with the Babylonians who preceded them, also destroyed cultic centers and conquered peoples. Cyrus, while mostly remembered as a great liberator, God's Messiah even, is also recorded deporting people groups. We can see the biased Herodotus for more. In his histories, he recalls how Cambyses II wreaked havoc upon the religious centers of Egypt, even fatally wounding the Apis bull. It may be surmised that Persia, as with the earlier Assyrian and Babylonian empires, was an expansionist empire. This is clearly evident in accounting for its sheer size, as it absorbed previously independent territories during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. And like the empires before it, it used population control and forced migration as an imperial and colonial tool to stymie resistance, maintain control, and reap the economic benefit of increased agricultural yields, and expand urban building projects through the translations of people and labor. Persia undoubtedly continued the Babylonian land for service tax system. Under Persian rule, the semi-free tethered persons to specific lands were also called shusheno, paying taxes in part through military service, agricultural, or construction labor. Yet they were distinct from the enslaved foreign minorities known as Kurtash, who worked as hard laborers on Achaemenid building projects. This being the case, we ask, what if repatriation or remigration was not simply a benevolent gesture, but a change in administrative policy that served imperial ends? Loosening servitude in Babylon then can be interpreted as the redistribution of construction labor in the empire's center back to their more peripheral sites of origin for conscription into the land for service sector in once fallow land. Not unlike the externalization of labor that was the transition from the Bracero program to the border industrialization program in the US. Evidence also suggests this as the Persians during the 5th century worked to secure the Via Maris and invested heavily in the reorganization of the Palestine coast, hill country, and Cis and Transjordan. Al-Stola finds, and I quote, the land for service sector proved to be a successful way to control Judean deportees and their descendants for more than 150 years after their deportation to Babylonia. There was no need to enslave the deportees, end quote. What Babylon had started and Persia continued was the administration of a far-reaching segmentation of labor, cheaper than the Assyrian model of continuous mass two-way deportation. Agreeing with Alstola, I think many Judeans were included in these agricultural and building projects throughout the empire, many as labor, but certainly all as a tax source, as the record in Nehemiah 5 of complaints of the burden presented by the king's taxes demonstrates. So then, we may view this so-called repatriation within the same lens of the US's immigration policies and border controls. That is, some labor is convenient in that it melts away when no longer needed and externalized where needs exist. Unfortunately, we are seeing forced externalization in mass begin anew today in our times. The new regime in Antiquity, that is, the Persians, potentially viewed the exiled Gola community, along with others, as a public charge and or had other needs of them elsewhere for actual revenue and resource generation in once fallow lands. The return and subsequent rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem can be understood not just through the lens of religious tolerance, but as an element of Achaemenid economic and immigration policy to deport peoples under the guise of voluntary removal away from the former imperial center, redistributing labor throughout the provinces, just as the Bracero program in the US morphed into the border industrialization program. It is an administrative strategy to simultaneously further fill the coffers back at Empire Center and to buttress buffers to Egypt. For certain, the yokes of servitude were still heavy, as we read in Nehemiah. Persia's exporting of labor then served the empire threefold. One, it externalized cost of care, much like the US does in not having to pay for medical care, education, etc., of those in the maquiladoras, which reduces public charge. Two, it helped to administer provincial buffer zones and further incorporate them into the imperial apparatus. And three, it created additional sources of revenue through the reestablishment of indigenous cultic centers and their treasuries, which were taxed. This potential injection of sustained revenue from the periphery was worthy of upfront financing, as we see in Ezra 6 and 8, not unlike the modern day tax abatements within the export processing zones. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we see the Persian Empire utilizing the Gola community to these ends, once back beyond the river in Yehud. This comparatively elite class receives the colonial communications, imperial commerce and administration, and secures a higher position within the segmented labor hierarchy in exchange for population management and revenue generation. Consequently, a higher degree of imperial acculturation occurred with at least some of the Gola community than with the general native Judean populace, the Am Haaretz, or the people of the land. Due in part to the return migration or remigration waves to Yehud of Babylonia, Judeans between 538 and 432 BCE, group conflict resurged. The Babylonian deportees of 597 BCE resulted in the dividing of Judahites into multiple groups. John Kessler identifies 6 such differentiating Yahwistic communities in existence during the Achaemenid period. We will concern ourselves with 2 of the 6. The Amhagola, the Babylonian returnees, which he identifies as a charter group, and 2, the Yehudite remainees, or the Am Haaretz, people of the land. The Amhagola, the people of the exile, were considered by the chronicler and the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel as the true descendants of the covenant people. They alone were the good figs from Israel, the remnant of Israel, the holy seed, according to this tradition. The Am Haaretz, the people of the land, were those who remained in Judah after the fall of Jerusalem and mixed with incoming immigrants to Judah or migrated to neighboring territories, mixed there, and returned. 2 Kings 24 and 14 reveals that also at play here are issues of class, as those carried into exile were, for the most part, at least initially, of the elite class, while those who remained were peasant farmers, people of the land. What has transpired in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE is that each of these groups experienced the phenomenon of dissimilation. Once part of the same minority group, because of imperial policies, now have become one another's proximate other. Simultaneously, as the Gola community acculturated to Babylon and later Persia in exile, it dissimilated from Palestinian Yehudite Judean language and culture. As a charter group re-entering Yehud, the Gola community reified its ethnic boundaries, and even more in proximity with the Yehudite Judean indigenous community, the Am Haaretz, and so sought to differentiate itself even more to maintain its comparatively elite status that it had descended from and maintained near the empire's center. According to the divergent perspectives among the Gola and the people of the land, the exiles interpreted the exile as a purifying and salvific act, as it saved them from the destruction of Jerusalem, whereas those who remained, the people of the land, saw the expulsion of the exiles as signifying their excision from the people of God, whose identity was tied to the land. Making meaning out of the reverberating events of exile and forced migration, internal displacement, proved integral to the continual process of socio-ethnic identity formation for all groups. As some of the groups re-encountered each other during the Gola repatriation or remigration, the gulf between the groups' interpretation of exile and an in-group proved too wide to bridge, as each claimed the experience as core to not only their social identity, but their ethnic identity and to their claim upon the land. Boundaries were reified and then seemingly ossified. The charter group Amhagola, through various mechanisms of differentiation, ethnicized the Amhaaretz, who were once part of their own ethnic group, toward the peoples of the land, the Ame Ha'aratzot, or non-Judahite ethnic groups. Anthropologist Seth Holmes states that the reproduction of a system of migrant labor hinges on the inability of the migrants as individuals or as a group to influence the institutions that subordinate them. This necessitates ongoing restrictions in the form of draconian legislation to separate migrants from the body politic, even to carve them out from their own ethnicities into a new one, managed and controlled by the state apparatus. Some mechanisms of this ethnicization via differentiation may be found in Ezra Nehemiah. First, the settlement list in Ezra Nehemiah, Ezra chapter 2, as well as Nehemiah chapter 7, functioned in essence as a passport registry for the return migration, demarcating which families were to have official resident status, constituting the remnant of Israel or holy seed, from those who were not and which would not be counted as part of the true Israel as envisioned by the elite Am HaGolah charter group, holders of the census registry. Ezra and Nehemiah, essentially with imperial backing, had instituted a show me your papers policy, underscoring the status of deportability of the Haaretz, as well as who could be expelled and denaturalized from the dominant group, as was the case with Tobiah, the Ammonite, and others, much as Mexicans were evicted from the dominant category of white in the 1930s in the US. Second, the Babylonian Hebrew dialectical variation became privileged. As we can read in Nehemiah 13, the Amhagolah group decried the fact that many children half spoke Ashdodite, and they could not comprehend or speak Judahite, as if it were a foreign language. Social circumstances allowed for a convergence of two separate languages or dialectical variations, much as with so-called Spanglish today in our own borderlands. This occurred both in Yehud among the peoples of the land, but also in Babylon over multiple generations in exile, allowing both groups to simultaneously dissimilate linguistically. Third, the practice of intermarriage was instituted as marrying impure Yehudites, Samaritans, Judeo-Moabites, Ammonites, or other foreigners was deemed unclean for boundary maintenance, ethnic retention, and right status before Adonai. All persons of mixed seed would come to be ethnicized as Am Haaretz, uh, uh, increasingly synonymous with non-Judahites, known collectively as the Ame Ha'aratzot. What is so ironic, though, is that the Am HaGolah do not recognize, or perhaps better, they do not want to recognize their own hybridity. Take, for example, Zerubbabel, who was a prominent member of the Golah community, a Persian appointed governor of Yehud under Darius I, whose own name derived from the Akkadian Zerbabili, or seed of Babylon. To review, some of the developing requirements to be Misrael, or from Israel, imposed by the Am HaGolah imperial charter group during the Persian period are: one, to demonstrate lineage of Judahites deported to Babylon by showing genealogical record papers as proof of holy seed. Two, to speak the exilic dialectical variation of the Hebrew language. And three, to maintain the holy seed by practicing endogamous sexual relations. As anthropologist Thomas Hyland Erickson observed, ethnic identities are neither ascribed nor achieved. They are both. They are wedged between situational selection and imperatives imposed from without, exacerbated then by changes in imperial labor and migration policy. We are here able to perceive the emergence of differentiating Judean ethnicities. Empire both erases and manufactures ethnicities to its benefit. perhaps after having acquired social status and having exited the more subordinate sectors of labor as a subsequent generation elite Judeo-Babylonians. Ezra and Nehemiah supposedly Artaxerxes himself, did not wish for their community, the Amhagolah, to remain in the bottom rungs of imperial servitude. They could almost taste some form of quasi self-governance in their arrival to Jerusalem. In the harsh reforms that we find in Ezra 9 and 10 and Nehemiah 13, I read a desperate attempt to further differentiate themselves from other Yahwistic groups who remained in Judah, particularly those who they referred to as the Am Haaretz, from whom they dissimilated while in Babylon, and who they now consider essentially the same as the Ame Haaretzot, the non-Judahite peoples of the land. They sought to differentiate themselves so that they would remain in a position above deportability, in opposition to empire's essential workers, the peoples of the land. Conceivably, Ezra and Nehemiah could ensure that the elite imperially authorized Amhagolah with control of the treasury in Jerusalem could comply with the silver standard of the tax system, while those who were of the former administration, as the former administrative center in Mitzvah and the Amhaaretz outside the city wall, would most likely have to comply with the service form of taxation. As the biblical accounts attest, though, no matter how endogamous and separate they had hoped to become, the Amhagolah were already a mixed seed. Social boundaries were not always so ossified, neither would they remain so. And sometimes these competing processes of boundary maintenance are simultaneous. Dissimilation and differentiation are always occurring. As Michel Foucault famously said, where there is power, there is resistance. This is what I propose the book of Ruth, a likely voice of the Haaretz, the people of the land, attempts to problematize the Amhagolah's primordialist notion of holy seed, showing that just as the future is hybrid, so too is the past, as distinct representations of Judean ethnicity germinated within Yehud during the Persian period. But I would say that talk on Ruth and resistance, ethnicity, and mestizaje for another lecture. Thank you very much. And with that, I will open us to any questions.
All right, thank you very much for your fascinating talk, Dr. Weiser. So we'll now open the floor to questions. So if you're watching live on YouTube, please submit your questions and we can read them out loud. Maybe to start off, would you mind talking a little bit more in detail about this interesting comparison that you draw between Spanglish and ancient linguistic practices that combined dialects for the purpose of assimilation? What are the ancient sources for this process?
Yeah, well, I made specific reference to Nehemiah 13, right? There was a little bit of hair pulling, a little bit of violence inflicted upon my interpretation as those who were the children, right? Who were growing up in Yehud that were no longer speaking, in my interpretation, the exilic variation or the Babylonian variation of Hebrew. So when Ezra and Nehemiah return, we're talking some time here, right? And my daughter is using words like cap and slay, and I'm like, what? That's just one generation, right? And so you can imagine that is going on, right, in near the center of empire, that there's a lot of neologisms, right? So new vocabulary that's coming into their exilic dialectical variation. And the same thing, if folks are rubbing elbows with folks from Ashdod, the same thing is happening in Yehud. And so there is a concerted effort for linguistic control, not unlike what we saw here in the 1930s through the 1960s with English only. school systems throughout, especially the borderlands, where many of folks would receive the back end of the ruler if any type of mixing of languages would occur.
Thank you. And then maybe on the similar train of thought, looking at this ethnic differentiation, do we see outside of language sources, textual sources, do we see this ethnic differentiation, these mixed seeds being depicted in other ways? For example, like artistic depictions of these people?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the there's the inscription. I'm actually blanking on Professor Brody, help me out. In Persia, is it Darius's grave where all of the ethnicities are aligned, right? But it's made in such a way that we're bringing all peoples together, but at the same time they're also uplifting the throne, right? See, so there is that brought into servitude. As far as the differentiation, I think that we see that in like, for example, in the Chicano movement, Chicano art, and because there was such a period whereby which we needed to assimilate in order to attain social and economic upward mobility, right? In the old sense of Anglo conformity. And what we see in the 60s and 70s is a backlash to that and a lifting up of ethnic retention or differentiation from the dominant group as a form of resistance. And I didn't get to go into that too much into this, but that's really the next talk in my line of work is looking at the Book of Ruth as just that, because it is a claiming. If we see the genealogy at the end, it's a hello, Ezra, hello, Nehemiah. Don't forget King David, his grandmother was actually Moabite. And in Ezra 9 and 10 and Nehemiah, we see Moabite is the ethnic people group that is actually added to the citation from Deuteronomy that was not there in the original, that should not be part of the Assembly of God.
Thank you. It looks like we have one question on YouTube. What is the connection between the Amharites, Amharic, and the Falasha Jews of Ethiopia?
Oh, what is the connection between what?
The Amharites, Amharic, and the Falasha Jews of Ethiopia.
I'm sure there is a connection, but that's really outside of my field of expertise. I'm really not going to be able to give a good answer on that, other than conjecture and speculation. I do know that, John Kessler talks about six different, in that time, right, in the Persian period of remigration, six different classes of Yahwistic communities. And, we oftentimes spend a lot of time, at least within the field of biblical studies, focusing on the portions that were carried off into forced migrations into Babylon. But there were, many forced, migrations. I would use the term as Seth Holmes does. Forced migration is, I feel like it's a false dichotomy between voluntary and involuntary. Migration, for the most part, is forced. And so even if people were not shackled and carried to Babylon, the Empire Center, but they left because of the destruction that was happening in Judea and went to Moab or went to Egypt, that in itself was that. And so I think there was quite a large scattering, and dissimilation and differentiation would have occurred among all of those groups wherever they found themselves.
Yeah.
Aaron, why don't you support?
Yeah, Marvin, thank you so much. This is just fascinating and also so timely. I wondered, you didn't really touch on, reading Ezra and Nehemiah. One of the things that I like to keep in mind has to do with kind of the fragility of the communities in exile. These are, as you nicely pointed out and covered, uh, elite members of Judean society who'd been physically removed from their homeland, from their status, from all kinds of things, um, moved into a foreign land, etc. But at the same time, it's not just the political machinations that are going on that you've so nicely described with reference to empire, whether it's Babylonian or Persian, etc. But there's also a view in those books and in other places in our Hebrew texts that implicate, of course, that this was a divine form of punishment.
Mm.
And so I see a lot of things going on it's very tentative because the next steps are both crucial for the survival of the group, whether it's the Babylonian group or the native Judean group that never left, etc. But they both have to do things that please God and please the empire. And so I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that sort of notion of fragility. And that's sort of part of the reason I see as essentially the Persians getting a good scorecard, in these books because they did there is pushback, but they didn't want to push back too hard, right?
Yeah, and there's even right the calling of Cyrus the Mashiach, I mean right there, right? And there's a lot of that imperial laden language there that would, give the rubber stamp of yes, we are allowing that. But there's also something else at play too, and I think around the fragility component is, and I think helps us see that this is just not very this is just not this or that, right? That there's just multiple layers here and it's very complex. I didn't talk about, for example, and I think it falls in line with your comment, is also of how around the settlement list time, there's a number of the Babylonian exiles that for some reason cannot produce papers, right? And why is this? And why can people not vouch for them? What is behind that? And to me, that's not just, at service of empire, right? But that services of reformulating a community with certain structures, right? That are going trying to push back against that fragility. There's something else at play there, right? And it almost creates a class that's wedged in between because those folks are not necessarily the people of the land, but it's kind of a middle piece. I think that there's a stratification that comes out of that. And we see that as they are reconstructing, the temple. So doing something to please God, right? After the going through punishment, but also at the directives and the blessing and upfront financing from the Imperial Center.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating and also, sort of taking a post-colonial view, the leaders that are so heralded in these books, both Ezra and especially Nehemiah, really are sort of caught betwixt and between, right? They, on the one hand, are trying to lead their own people, and yet they have to do so under the thumb, so to speak, or under the blessing of empire, of the Persians. And it's a very fine line to tread, right?
And we can put a psychological lens on that, right? Too, and look at the double bind, right? Because these folks, yes, they are part of what John would say the elite charter group, and they also are carrying on in such a way of what anthropologist who wrote the book on Maya Town, observing migrant communities in the Carolinas, of how some folks, caciques, would rise up in the U.S. and actually treat folks within their own community not so well because of the social conditions. And that was not happening in the highlands of Guatemala, but it was happening in the U.S. because of new alliances, socially and politically. So it is a really betwixt and between darned if you do, darned if you don't scenario.
Amazing. And how human nature doesn't really change so much over the millennia. Anyway,
That's why we have to build coalitions.
All right, and with that, I think we'll wrap up this talk. Thank you very much again, Dr. Weiser. Please join us warmly thanking today's speaker for sharing his research. The next talk in this series is on February 20th at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Dr. Yana Mokrosova will be sharing a talk titled Shifting Boundaries, Moving People, Investigating Change in Archaic Western Anatolia. And we look forward to seeing you then.